So, Mr. Kirby, in your most recent book, A Private Life, you speak quite extensively about your early childhood years and the moments that really defined you during this time. What we're interested in hearing from you is your experience as a student at university. So why did you choose law at Sydney University, and how did this define you?
I wasn't really good at mathematics at school, although I did quite well in the leaving certificate. In the end I got it, but it hadn't been a career path that I would have taken that required a lot of skills in mathematics, like a medical degree or a scientific degree or psychology where statistics was important. So I wasn't patient enough to be a teacher, nor holy enough to be a minister of religion, and accordingly, by a process of elimination, what did I get to at the bottom of the list? Law. And I was good at debating. I did very well in history, and so it was a sort of a natural fit. I also went to Fort Street High School, which has a long legal tradition, and we were constantly being visited by judges of the school who were old boys of the school, and that seemed to be an attractive and alluring occupation, and so it has proved.
Excellent. And so your experiences of studying at the University of Sydney, is that a time you look back on fondly?
Indeed I do. And I had wonderful lecturers, in particular Julia Stone, who had a profound effect on me. Indeed, people have said that if you want to understand the Mason High Court, you have to look at the fact that the justices of the High Court of Australia at the time that Chief Justice Mason was the Chief Justice, primarily came from the Sydney Law School during Julia Stone's period. At a time in Australia where legal education and the legal profession were being told by the distinguished Chief Justice Sir Owen Dixon that law was essentially a formal, mechanical and entirely predictable and objective outcome, Julius Stone was essentially a legal realist, and he was teaching that the values that judges have a profound effect on their decisions, and that they have to be conscious of it, aware of it, and transparent about it. So that was a different message. He was not on message to the principal instruction that was orthodoxy in the law, and that made it all the more interesting. Taught me that sometimes dissent has a point.
I suppose this was also the time of Lord Denning's jurisprudence as well.
It was, and Lord Denning came to the Sydney Law School and came to the university, and I was then involved in the Law Society, the Students' Law Society, and in the SRC and the Union. So I chaired a dinner which Lord Denning addressed, and presented him with a very large photograph of himself, which my father had purchased at my request from the Sydney Morning Herald. He signed it, Denning MR, and I still have it here. I'll show it to you before you go. Denning MR. We conducted a very happy conversation throughout our respective judicial lives. He was a most amazing man, and though I didn't agree with everything he wrote as a judge, on some matters he was teaching the lesson that Stone was teaching in classrooms, that the law is not inflexible, that the reason the common law has survived is that it adapts to new challenges and new circumstances. So that was, he was another of my heroes.
So you would certainly say you were influenced by his sense of justice being paramount?
Yes, but I didn't always agree with his sense of justice. One of his brothers was a bishop, and he tended to be a little bit orthodox, according to the views of that time, on issues such as women's position and in the law, and sexuality and matters of that kind. So he was a product of his time, just as I am a product of my time, and just as you will be products of your time. Each generation has new perceptions of justice, and that's a very important reason for turnover in the High Court of Australia. Some judges gnash their teeth and say this is terrible that the judges are thrown out at the age of 70, but I support the Constitution in that respect. I think it's important to give every generation a chance to serve on the court.
And so we've spoken about some key people in your life that really influenced you. What would be the main advice that you'd give students today? I mean, we know that you speak quite extensively to students at their respective law schools, and what would be the advice that you give students? Well,
the most important advice is to be a joiner. I was always a joiner. I got involved in everything. I joined the student law societies and activities around the university concerned with Aboriginal rights, which were only then emerging in Australia. The rights of people from different racial groups, overseas students' rights in Australia, the rights of women, and the Council for Civil Liberties. So that's how I had my glorious career as a student politician and as a civil libertarian, because I was a joiner. It means you have to work a bit harder, but it's fun. It's a moral cause, and you get noticed. People know you, get to know you. It was my activities in student politics that got me noticed by Neville Wran, and he was a great friend of Lionel Murphy, and I think maybe my involvement in student politics and the Council for Civil Liberties led on to my glorious professional career. Everything is integrated, but you won't do that if you're sitting at home just watching your screen.
Yes, good advice. You mentioned that in your early career as a lawyer there was certainly a sense of don't ask, don't tell. How progressive were students when you were at university?
Not progressive at all.
So were you still not open at that stage when you were at university?
Oh no, of course not. No, in those days one was expected to be thoroughly and completely and totally ashamed of yourself. And I didn't particularly feel ashamed of myself, but I knew that was what I had to act out. That was the life that was apparently destined for me. And the hardest thing was that you couldn't even really discuss it with your parents or with your siblings. This was a very nasty element, and there are some people in our society, particularly in the churches, who would like to go back to those days of the binary division of men and women. And unfortunately for them, the world is more complicated, and we now know, thanks to scientific work of Dr. Kinsey and Evelyn Hooker and the Kinsey Institute, that human sexuality is on a spectrum, and it's not quite as straightforward as they would like it to be.
Excellent. So we did mention quite briefly, you mentioned human rights in Australia. How optimistic are you about the direction of protecting human rights in Australia, particularly in regard to minority groups and bringing respect and inclusion to minority groups in Australia?
Well, we don't do a bad job by the world standards. Australia is a pretty rights-respecting society. The common law, as you know, has a very deep principle that in the event that Parliament appears to be trying to take away basic rights, courts are instructed to read the legislation strictly and to read it so as to uphold the basic rights of the individual. And that is a rule which was stated in the earliest days of the High Court of Australia in the Jumbunna case and in Potter and Minahan, and it's a rule that is applied all the time. As well as that, our parliaments are accountable to the people, and that tends to make them careful in matters that affect basic rights. But every now and again our parliaments do things which are not respectful of fundamental rights. One instance that was brought home to me when I was a young boy was the Communist Party Dissolution Act, which was passed by our federal parliament in 1950 to ban the Communist Party. And because a family member was a leading figure in the Communist Party, I got to see it from a personal perspective, and the first time I ever heard of the High Court of Australia was when it made its decision in Australian Communist Party against the Commonwealth, 1951. So that struck down the Communist Party Dissolution Act, and a referendum of the people refused to give the federal parliament the power to ban people for what they believed in terms of politics. So every now and again our parliaments either do nasty things to minorities or fail to protect the rights of minorities. The Mabo decision, whose 20th anniversary we are about to celebrate in June 2012, was an instance where Parliament, elected parliaments in one of the oldest democracies in the world, Australia, had not corrected the mistake of the common law in the 19th century of denying Aboriginal people the right to title in their land. That had to be addressed by the High Court. So that you need an interaction between courts with lawyers and matters of principle, plus the legislatures addressing the issues of rights of the day.
I suppose another example of the tyranny of the masses, as it were, detracting from individual rights would be the discriminatory treatment that's given to homosexual people in terms of marriage. Of course, recently President Obama has come out in support of it, but our Prime Minister has shrugged off Obama's change in stance. What do you make of the current situation?
Well, I make of it that it's a mess and that it needs to be fixed up. I myself don't necessarily go along with the celebrity politics that because the President of the United States rather belatedly comes out in favour of the issue of marriage equality, that is something we in Australia necessarily have to follow. We are ourselves, we have our own country and our own values. One would have been forgiven for thinking that Australia was a less religious society. We had a strong tradition until quite recently of secularism, and people had their religions but they kept them to themselves. This is because the British tradition, after the Tudor kings and queens were burning people of opposite religions, came to the conclusion that secularism was the best protection for people of religion and people of no religion. But nowadays it seems that the religions have a disproportionate space in determining what the civil rights made by a law of the Parliament of Australia grant to citizens. And this is a really shocking thing, I think. But I believe we will sort this out, and we will probably do it sooner rather than later. But it will need a bit of a push, and it will need heterosexual people to support marriage equality. The majority of people in our society are heterosexual. Fortunately, there was an article in The Economist about a month ago which said that in the big transnational corporations, the push for equal rights for gays in the corporations is coming from straights. They don't feel comfortable with their colleagues at work being treated in a discriminatory way and unequally. And I hope all young lawyers are of this view, that they draw a distinction between marriages and weddings. Marriage is a civil right made by law. Weddings are things you can opt for if you want to. My understanding is that nowadays the census reveals that only about a third of people are getting married in churches. Most people get married in Australia in a civil ceremony, so that our country is turning towards the European tradition of distinguishing between the marriage, which is a legal right granted by the state with duties attached to it, and the wedding, which, if you are religious, you can go and opt for. And I wouldn't force religious people to marry gays if they don't want to or think it's against their doctrine. But Section 47 of the Marriage Act in Australia protects ministers of religion and churches and religious organisations from having to marry if they don't want to do so.
You mentioned in your book that you were fortunate enough to see some degree of change in belief among those in the Salvation Army. Are you optimistic that other religions can become more tolerant?
Well, the Salvation Army is a fairly evangelical denomination of Christianity. And if change can be witnessed there, particularly amongst young salvos, I think it should be able to come elsewhere. I don't want to comment on other religions because I'm not a member of their denominations or other faiths. But I am an Anglican, and I have seen in my own lifetime the shift in the Anglican Church, the ordination of women as priests, the consecration of women as bishops. In some places in the world, the ordination and consecration of gays. A non-discriminatory attitude to human beings is my understanding of a central message of Christianity. It's in part a reason why it's been such a successful world religion, because it took the stance at the beginning that it was a religion available neither circumcised nor uncircumcised, neither Jew nor Gentile, neither men nor women, no discrimination. But there's just this little nasty bit of discrimination against gays. And fortunately, even on that, the Anglican Church is having a world debate, and I hope that it will come to the right conclusion. But I don't want to go on about religion because you then get trapped into becoming part of the problem. Religion is my private space, and my partner is totally opposed to religion. He can't understand why I have anything to do with it. But I just stick with my religion, and it's a private thing. I'm hopeful that my denomination is going to muddle through to the right conclusion.
Now, Mr. Kirby, you've done some incredible things in your life, and you've had so many extraordinary achievements. What do you feel is your most outstanding achievement? What are you most proud of in your life?
I think my best achievement, it's for other people to say, to answer that question, but I think my best achievement is being open about my sexuality. I mean, at the bottom line, we're all just human beings. We're all got a very short time in this world. My father died last November and reminded me again that it's a very temporary existence we have. We have a chance to do kind things and to support one another and to be conscious of our world, to be conscious of human beings in other countries and of animals and sentient creatures. And we have a chance to be formalistic, narrow, literalistic, indifferent to suffering, unconcerned about breaches of human rights, concerned only with making a lot of money and living in a palatial home and working in a tower in the city with a beautiful view of Sydney Harbour. I mean, you can take your choice. You can do one or the other. And I took the former path, and I would urge it for consideration on young lawyers, because life is too short to be nasty to one another. And unfortunately, there are some people and some lawyers out there who are unconcerned about that. Well, I am concerned about it.
Mr. Kirby, is that part of the reason why you took a judicial posting so early in your career? That you wanted to be a part of this institution that could make life better for the people and change things for the better?
I suppose in part there was that, but I was offered at the age of 35 what was then a very high judicial post, a federal a post with equivalent to judicial status in an area of practice, industrial relations, which I was performing a lot of at the bar. Therefore, it was a natural thing to do at that stage in my career when I was offered it. Looking back, it's extraordinary that I was so resistant to the idea of going off to the Law Reform Commission, because that it was that really expanded my brain, got me to see the way the law operates and the way reform of the law is part and parcel of the reason why the common law is such a successful legal system, because it's always adapting and adjusting. But I ultimately took that post, and that then led me into other judicial positions, and I have been very fortunate. But like the film Dead Poets Society, when I got opportunities, I worked my guts out. I made the most of them. I jumped on the desk. I stood up for what I believed in. And I'm still an optimist and an idealist about the law. And I haven't become cynical, and I would urge that too, to remain optimistic about the law. We can make the law a useful instrument of justice. When we take our oaths, it's about the law, but it's also about the attainment of justice, and that's what gives our profession its magic. It's what gives it a moral foundation, that we're concerned with justice.
Mr. Kirby, on your website, I was just reading it last night, and I see you attract posts from a wide range of people. You attract posts from young people, from socially economically disadvantaged people, from homosexual people. Everybody sees you as a figure that they look up to. Why do you think that's the case?
Well, I was most proud, I don't know if you saw it, that I received a post from the principal of a Patrician Brothers Catholic school in the western suburbs of Sydney just 2 days ago, because earlier in the week I had been invited by students at that school to come out and talk to them. Now, Catholic social doctrine is very congenial to me, though I was brought up in a Protestant Anglican tradition. But on the issue of women, women's rights and women's equality, and on the issue of gays and gay rights and gay equality, it's not quite so good, in my humble opinion. But they knew that that was my stance, and they still invited me. And here was a letter from the principal thanking me for speaking and saying God bless. Well, I think that's a nice thing, and I'm very proud of that accolade. So why people write to me? Well, I don't know. You'll have to ask them or ask yourself. When I go to law schools, I have a good rapport with the students. I think maybe I'm a sort of late developer. Maybe I'm in tune with the younger generation's values. I'm not yet twittering, and I don't myself have a Facebook page, although some students in Adelaide set up a Facebook page. To be frank, I have to come in here at 5 a.m. every morning to answer about 4 hours of emails. So I don't know how you young people keep up with the pressure of instantaneous communication, which can become so overwhelming that you don't stop and think. And stopping and thinking is the way we challenge assumptions. And I think it's very important, particularly if you're a lawyer, to challenge assumptions, because the assumptions were maybe correct or at least understandable at the time they were adopted. But every new generation, in the light of knowledge, in the light of science, in the light of changing values and attitudes, has to question the assumptions of the past. And that's the challenge I would throw down to your generation. Don't just accept it. Question and never give up.
And Mr. Kirby, you're still so active in numerous roles as a member of the Eminent Persons Group and the Global Commission on HIV and the Law. what motivates you to continually be so active and have such a predominant role in these organisations?
Well, I get appointed to these things, and I'm not the type who is happy to be just a name on the letterhead. Sorry, but if they want that, they've got to go to other more respectable lawyers. Once I get involved, I roll up my sleeve, I get engaged, and I get active, and I start questioning. And even yesterday, I gave out some awards for equality in employment of gay GLBTIQ people in Australia. And it was wonderful to see the big corporations, mega corporations, Telstra, Goldman Sachs, all the repeat players, the Australian Federal Police, big employers. But I threw down the challenge that we've got to think about the service station in Wagga Wagga, or the grocery shop, the 7-Eleven store over there in Albany. We've got to be concerned with the family business and the prejudice and attitudes that exist there, so that I'm always thinking how we can improve things. When I was a little boy, to go to the Anglican church involved crossing Parramatta Road. My parents didn't think that was a good thing, so I was sent just up the street to a Methodist church, and the Methodists always had a very strong social engagement, and they were people who were doers and shakers, and I think that got into my mind. In fact, on Sunday this week, I'm going to the Uniting Church in St Ives for Law Week, because Saint Yves is the patron saint of lawyers. So I thought, well, I should go there, and they've put on in the service my favourite Wesleyan hymn, which is a hymn about improving the world and doing so by the light of liberty and the light of knowledge. And I think liberty and knowledge can help us to improve our world, and we should never give up trying.
Mr. Kirby, thank you so much. It's been an honour.
Thank you. Good luck with your studies, but more importantly, good luck with your lives.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.